everybody. Welcome to the module on sustainable development. My name is Dr. Lavanya. I'm an assistant professor at BITS Pilani, Hyderabad campus. Today we're going to be talking about how sustainable development came to define public policy when it comes to dealing with ideas of development and the environment. This particular module is based on a book by Adams. It was published in 2009 and titled Green Development, Environment and Sustainability in a Developing World. It's a very interesting book, and most of what I'm going to speak of here comes from the first to the fourth chapter. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals have driven activities by both government and non-governmental organizations. It defines actions by actors as far apart as NGOs and, say, government agents working at the state as well as at the international level. How did it become so important? That's what we're going to try to look at in this particular module. To do that, I've divided this module into three parts. The first part is on Stockholm and the World Conservation Strategy. One is a conference and the other is a document that's widely circulated and accepted by many countries. The second part is titled The Brundtland Report and Caring for the Earth. Again, two documents which span a decade, which define the way we understand sustainable development in the coming decade. And the final decade, which we enter into, is the third part of this module, which is from 1992 to 2002, which is the Rio Conference and the World Summit on Sustainable Development. So as you can see, what we're going to do in this particular module is look at a series of summits held from the 70s to 2002, and through doing that, looking at the documents that come out of each of these conferences to understand how sustainable development gets articulated, and more importantly, how it's accepted by the governments of the world, and therefore defining policy all around the world. By the end of this particular module, you will understand the discourse on sustainable development. You should understand then how this discourse becomes central to understanding the relationship between environment and development. And finally, you will be able to picture how this defines public policy all around the globe. This particular module relates to the previous module on the concept of sustainability, and I'll keep referring back to that module. So please make sure to watch that module first before you watch this module. So let's start. Part 1. Part 1 is about the Stockholm Conference held in 1972 and the World Conservation Strategy 1980. Now, let's just draw out the picture of this timeline that we're going to be talking about in this module. Sustainable development for the first time is codified as sustainable development in the 1970s by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. I'll keep referring to this organization. I'll call it IUCN, right? That's the acronym. So it was first brought out at this point of time, and it was first developed in the World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Report, 1987, in a document called Our Common Future. This document is freely available to be downloaded online. Please, I encourage all of you all to do so and read it. It's after this that Agenda 21 comes up during the Rio Conference in 1992. And then finally, in 2002, you have the World Summit on Sustainable Development. So the summit itself gets called the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and this summit is called the Earth Summit. So sustainable development by 2002 becomes the key idea to define the way in which we're understanding the world. And this conference was in Johannesburg. So by 2002, it becomes central. And from 2002, climate change debates start to take over, and all of these debates are also based on this timeline that I was talking about, on this trajectory of the development of the concept of sustainable development that happened about 30 years ago. So let's do this. Stockholm, 1972. This forum, or the idea of having this particular forum, was mooted in the UN by Sweden. So this conference is basically called the Conference on the Human Environment, all right? And it was held in Stockholm in June of 1972, which is why it's called the Stockholm Conference. The primary motivation behind the UN's decision to actually have this particular conference was to have an alternative. At this point of time, UN was deliberating having a conference on atomic energy. This time, the Sweden representative in the UN basically decided to moot the idea instead of having a conference on environment. It was motivated by a very first world idea of environmentalism. They had concerns about pollution, concerns about acid rain, and they felt that these concerns have to be discussed. in order to do that, they proposed the conference, the UN accepted it, and they decided to have it. So the preparation for this conference starts in 1968, and the commission or the committee that was set up in order to prepare for this conference was headed by Maurice Strong. Now remember this name Maurice Strong because he becomes very important as this particular concept develops. So this chair comes up, they set up, they from 1968 they start actually thinking of having this organization, having this conference. However, not all the countries in the world are happy with it. Most of the opposition come from the developing countries. Now, why would the developing countries be weary of having a conference on environmental concerns? The main thing is, and the main problem according to the developing countries, was that the idea of development and environment seemed to have been segregated. All right, people were talking about ensuring conservation, ensuring that there's no pollution, ensuring that the industries are clean, without really talking about developmental concerns that developing and underdeveloped countries have. For example, when you're faced with hunger, poverty, disease, and remember we're talking of 1970s, we have the developed countries having reached a level of development thanks to the last 100 years. But 1950s to 1970s see a host of countries, including India, actually getting freedom. It's only now we can even think of developing. And now if you bring in environmental concerns, wouldn't that then allow the developed countries to stop the growth of the developing and underdeveloped countries? This was the concern that was brought in by the developing countries. It was very pertinent also in the backdrop of the Cold World War. Remember, this is 1970, so the Cold War is going on. You have the end of the Second World War. 1960s and 70s is when Cold War is at its peak, and you have the UN, which is dominated by one particular faction of the Cold War, which is the US. And again, this concern is within the developing and underdeveloped countries that they would use the idea of environmentalism to stop development. They were also very concerned of bringing in neo-Malthusian ideas. Now, what do we mean by this idea of neo-Malthusian ideas? Malthus was a thinker who was about 100 years ago or before 1972, who was talking about the problem of population. Now, if I were to ask any of you, what is the biggest problem with environment, you would say population, right? And this is an idea that Malthus actually brings in. Remember the example I used in the previous module of St. Matthew's Island and the reindeers? Let me repeat. St. Matthew's Island, a couple of reindeers brought in, they basically graze, there's overpopulation, it reaches a point of crisis, and this point of crisis Malthus calls the idea wherein which thereafter there would be disease, there would be famine, and the population would have a precipitous drop. And that was Malthus's idea, that if population continues to grow and grow and grow, it would explode and it would go beyond carrying capacity, and because of that we would ultimately lead to great tragedies and the Black Death. Revitalizing or bringing new life to these neo-Malthusian ideas was what the developing countries feared. Why? Because where are the most number of people in the world? In the developing and underdeveloped nations. Hence, the developed nations could always turn around and say the problem of environment and degradation is because of these number of people in the developing and underdeveloped world. So the developing countries had a very, very pertinent critique of having such a big conference on environment. Basically saying that you may divorce these two ideas of development and environment, that you may bring in neo-Malthusian ideas, and third, we have short-term concerns of poverty, hunger, jobs, and environmental concerns are long-term concerns. We first need to ensure that we don't die before we actually think about having clean water, food, etc. So in order to actually deal with this contradiction or with this critique, Strong basically decided, okay, let's have a meeting before the 1972 conference. So a preparatory committee with 27 experts come together in Fornex, Switzerland in June of 1971. And the main reason for this meeting was to allay the concerns of the third world countries. Now, the result of this meeting was that they did so. The entire focus of that particular conference expanded. They thought of bringing in concerns of environment and development. Now, Fornex meeting did not really break new conceptual grounds, but it did make a statement of faith, saying we will talk of both development and environment. We will combine both of these concerns and we will take into consideration the fear of the third world countries, their idea of poverty will become central to this entire discourse. All right, and this is what happened during the Stockholm Conference. Now you should remember something. Stockholm 1972 Environmental Conference was only attended by two prime ministers. All the other countries send representatives, but only two prime ministers or heads of state come in. One of those heads of state was Indira Gandhi. Now, Indira Gandhi, representing India, makes a statement, and I'm going to read this statement because it kind of exemplifies the concerns of the developing and underdeveloped countries. She says, "Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters? How can we speak to those who live in villages and in slums about keeping the oceans and the rivers and the air clean when their own lives are contaminated at the source? The environment cannot be improved in conditions of poverty, nor can poverty be eradicated without the use of science and technology." This really exemplifies the entire problem at that time. One, we have to deal with poverty, we have to have development to deal with poverty, and we have to deal with environmental problems. Two, in the name of environmentalism, the developed countries shouldn't keep their own science and technology to themselves, which was something that they were doing at that point of time. However, the direct links between poverty and environmental degradation weren't really explored in this particular conference. And as I said in the previous module, I have talked about how simplistic these links were understood. But nevertheless, what this does is the Stockholm Conference does give space for this discussion. What happens? After a great amount of deliberation, they come out with 26 principles and 109 recommendations, actions that are needed. Now, these principles are wide-ranging. For example, you have principles on human rights, which is Principle 1, one on nuclear disarmament, which was Principle 26, the need for environmental education and research, Principle 19 and 20. There was a general idea that we should not pollute, which was Principles 6 and 7, the need for safeguarding the wild and natural resources, the need to share non-renewable resources, which is Principle 5, the need to cooperate on international issues, and the stress on the rights of individuals to not be exposed to pollution and resource politics, which was Principle 16 and 21. But more importantly, in the context of what we've been discussing, were the principles that actually gave space for the third world concerns. Now, when I use this word third world, you'll hear this many times when people talk about environment. It's again something that comes out thanks to the Cold War. The world was divided into three, right? You had the first world, which was the West. You had the second world, which was USSR and all of its allies. And you had the third world, which was the rest of the entire world, the developing and the underdeveloped countries, right? So when we're talking about the third world, we're talking about the developing and the underdeveloped countries. So in order to allay their concerns, certain principles were brought in, and they were very interesting principles. One of the fundamental points is that development need not be impaired by environmental protection, Principle 11, saying that we can develop and have concerns for environment. This was achieved by integrated development planning, Principle 13, and the rational planning to resolve conflicts between environment and development, Principle 14. Now, they don't tell us how we're going to do it, but they say we have to do it. Furthermore, development was needed to improve the environment, Principle 8. This would require assistance, financial assistance, Principle 9. Money in order to safeguard environment, Principle 12. A reasonable price for exports, Principle 10. So all of this talks of development as well as environment and financing environmental protection. So Stockholm did a lot. For the first time, you had this discussion on an international forum. You had different countries of the world coming together and agreeing on these principles. But the most visible result of Stockholm was the creation of the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP. To you and I, the UNEP is an established organization, but it was only created in 1972 after this particular conference, wherein the General Assembly of the United Nations in December of 1972 passed this order to create it. Now, you should remember that UNEP is located in Nairobi, all right, which is in Kenya. It is one of the very few UN organizations that has its headquarters outside of the developing world. So following Stockholm, international debates on sustainable development began, and these were debates that concerned itself with poverty and concerned itself with the ideas of bringing the development discourse into our understanding of environmentalism. Now, this particular idea was taken forward in the World Conservation Strategy. This comes out in 1980. Now, the thinking behind the World Conservation Strategy comes from the concept of eco-development. Again, a concept I've spoken about in the previous module on the concept of sustainability. Now, the term eco-development was basically coined by Maurice Strong. Remember, I told you to remember him? So he was the Secretary General of the Stockholm Conference, and he coined this idea of eco-development. When the UNDP decided to actually bring out this particular document on the World Conservation Strategy, they first had a lot of discussion on it. They had discussions on the eco-development idea in various conferences around the world. A few examples are the meeting in Belo Horizon in Brazil in 1978, which was the International Workshop in Eco-Development and Appropriate Technologies. In Berlin in 1979, they had the Conference on Eco-Farming and Eco-Development. And in Ottawa in Canada in 1986, they had the UNCN Conference on Conservation and Development. In all of these conferences, they basically discussed what do we mean by eco-development. The notion behind eco-development was a conscious awareness that there's intrinsic complexities and dynamic properties of ecosystems and the way in which they interact with humans that determine both environmental outcomes as well as development outcomes. Right? So this is the idea that was behind the World Conservation Strategy that was published in 1980. It was published by the IUCN, the UNEP, and World Wildlife Fund together. Now, what did they talk of? What did this document talk of? The World Conservation Strategy basically had three main objectives when it came to conservation. One, they said, to maintain essential ecological processes and life systems on which human survive and development depends. Listen to this. We're saying that these ecosystems, whether they be water, whether they be gas, whether they be renewable, non-renewable, they're not just required to be maintained for environmental purposes, but also for development, right? Two, to preserve genetic diversity on which depends the functioning of many of the above processes and life support systems, the breeding programs necessary for the protection and improvement of plants, domestic animals, microorganisms, as well as much more scientific and medical advances, technical innovations, and the security of many industries that use living resources. Again, in one objective, they're saying, why is genetic diversity important for the environment? But they're also saying, why is genetic diversity also important for development? And third, to ensure the sustainable utilization of species and ecosystems which support millions of rural communities as well as major industries. Here they're talking about fisheries, forestry, wildlife, water, right? All of this is required not only for the livelihoods of rural people or people who are dependent on these resources, but also for many industries. So these were the three major objectives of WCS, and the World Conservation Strategy ensured that they spoke of conservation. They spoke of the ways in which we conserve by taking into considerations the needs and demands of development as well. So let's recap. Stockholm was the conference that brought the idea of sustainable development into national, international debates. It was the one that set about addressing this relationship between environment and development in a public policy front. In the previous module, you've seen that this concept was debated for hundreds of years. But when does it come to be front and central when it comes to public policy and international relations? It's after Stockholm, after 1972. It sets up the UNEP. Now, UNEP is the one that's been funding environmental research all over the world since the 1970s. And it also sets up the fundamental ideas that then leads to WCS, which talks of how do we conserve. Remember, Stockholm gives us the general idea. WCS goes into much more detail of how do we bring in both environmental concerns and conservation concerns, that they're not really opposite to each other. We also have to note that the WCS, or after the WCS was published, the UNCN established a Conservation for Development Center, CDC, in 1979. Anybody who's interested in conservation would realize how important this particular center is to the entire discourse and the various treaties we've had on conservation thereafter. So this brings us to the end of our first topic, the first two conferences, one conference, one publication, that set the stage for understanding sustainable development in terms of the policy creation at the international level. In the next session, we will take this further and look at two very, very important conferences that go on to actually define it and also get on board different other countries and define the decade in which those particular conferences were held. Thank you.